My name is Sam Zimmerman. I'm the curator of Shudder, and I am privileged to welcome the director of Parents, Mr. Bob Balaban. Hello.
Was anybody scared to death? No.
Who had never seen Parents before? Look at that. Did you like it? That's what I want.
I have to say that. I should leave the room when you ask that question.
Bob, go out. We'll ask everyone if they liked it. Bring you
This
back
movie
in.
really upset people. I don't know if they were upset when they saw it, but in the beginning, it's in Toronto. I love Toronto, but it's a kinder, gentler place. In the beginning, I couldn't find key people. Like, they come for the interview, and somebody was coming to be an assistant production designer or something, and she said, well, I don't really want to do this movie. I just came in to tell you you're evil. How can you do this to a small child? And he's going to be in the movie and he has to jump in a vat of blood. And I said, well, it's not really blood. You know, the child won't really know. And he didn't know, and he had a very good time, actually.
Well, since you mentioned it, I'd love to talk about that shot. It's such an incredible transition, him jumping onto the bed right into the blood. Tell us how you pulled that off.
Well, we got a big vat of blood. And then it turned out that sweet little Brian Brodeur, who's, when we had auditions, do you mind if I skip around a little bit?
No, go for it.
So when we had auditions, we obviously had to find a little boy in Canada whose parents were willing to let him be in the movie. And when we had a casting call for like an 8-year-old boy to star in a movie, everybody came in who had done Wonder Bread commercials. So they were, they were great-looking, happy, cheerful, normal children.
Wonderful Toronto children.
They were really wonderful, but we couldn't have them. So we kind of, at one point, they sent me around to schools, like grammar schools, and I would go at recess and watch them playing. And I felt like this is like we're preying on the children. It seemed so horrible to be doing that. And then it turned out that somebody who was working on the movie, their neighbor, had an incredibly strict, there was a man who was like a Marine sergeant father and a very passive mother, and they raised this little boy, Brian Brodeur. Basically, this movie was the story of his life. I mean, aside from being the story of my life, it was a miracle that we found him. And the one rule was, I said to his parents, do not ever let him read the script. I don't want him to learn lines. Please don't coach him. Don't do anything. We'll just have fun. And we had a few days of sitting around, and I would get him used to the fact that I would be talking during all of his takes. And the only training that he had to have was don't look at me when I'm talking. And he was, he didn't have to do a whole lot of things, but he was, for a little child who had never been on a movie set, it was it really worked well for him, and he kind of became a little of his own person during it, which was nice, although it never led to him getting any more work.
He feels incredibly naturalistic in the film,
yes.
Which is an incredible contrast, I think, to the stylized world you create.
Well, that's a nice thing.
Talk to us a little bit about that world. I think this film came out in a time, even with you working with Angelo Badalamenti, which is we see a lot of filmmakers grappling with what's underneath the surface of the suburbs, especially. You saw that in Brian Usna's Society, in Parents, in some of Lynch's work.
Yes, it is a kind of a theme, I guess.
What drew you to that theme, and why did you want to grapple with it?
Well, it was interesting. I was directing Penn and Teller at Showtime, in the early days of Showtime, I guess, in a little movie that they had made. And somebody from the accounting department sent a note to me and said, would you read my script? And I said, sure, it's okay. And I read the script, and I immediately reacted to it for reasons that I didn't right away understand, but it was clear to me once I looked back on it. I grew up in the 50s. I have to preface this, my parents were lovely people who didn't eat anybody, as far as I know. I don't really know. But I do know that I grew up in a family that was perfect. You had to look perfectly, you had to act perfectly. There were actual problems with some people in my family that I was not allowed to learn about till I was 30 years old. Then I was let into some of the deep, dark, horrible secrets of my family, which weren't that dark, but I might have liked knowing that my mother had been married to somebody else before she was married to my father, for example. So I really reacted very much to the we're perfect. It was written actually to be in an old haunted house, which is kind of scary people. And the writer Chris Hawthorne, who's a lovely fellow, had no problem. I said, I think you have to set it in the Jetsons world of 1958. We found a suburb in Toronto that had been built in 1958, and every building was intact for, I don't know, a quarter of a mile, a huge amount of these houses, one of which we used as our exterior. Obviously, we built the interior. But it just seemed very important to me that my whole growing up was all about the fear under the normalcy. And I actually had even read a book. I was trying to think of the name of it, but of course couldn't. Maybe somebody here knows. When one of the actors came, Sandy Dennis, who I loved, and we could talk about that later. Yeah, I couldn't believe she was willing to do this. I don't know what convinced her. I really don't know. But anyway, yes.
Well, what's exciting is you also, outside of the fear underneath the sort of perfect image, there's also a general sense of childhood fear, which is, what do my parents do? You put me to sleep at night and I have no idea what you do after. Who are you people?
Well, the book that I was referencing, without knowing the name of the author or the book, was actually a book about children perceive everything, and the things that are not talked about and the things that are not allowed to be mentioned are usually the most terrifying because they are aware that something is going on and their imaginations are very fertile, and if they don't know what it is, they come up with this, basically.
You, before Parents, directed some of Tales from the Dark Side, which we talked briefly about outside. You mentioned to me about reading horror comics as a child. That feels very of a piece with Tales from the Dark Side, the small stories of comeuppance and traditional horror. How did you get into that, and what excites you about working within the genre?
Well, I don't know, actually. I like special effects. Not that this has a lot of them, but I was able to, in my own very primitive way, there was obviously no CGI, and the special effects are all the camera shaking, and it's kind of a mess. But I've always enjoyed film magic, and I think I was attracted to something that I thought potentially could have some of that. And my favorite movies as a little kid were the Friday night specials with Vampira and people like that. And I loved, I thought The Invisible Man was one of the most frightening movies I've ever seen.
Great.
And why was it frightening? He was just invisible. He didn't hurt anybody, did he?
He's also very mean.
Was he mean?
He's a real asshole.
But did he hurt anybody?
Oh, yes. He hurts, I think he just pushes over baby carts.
Well, I don't remember in my Invisible Man. I don't think he did that.
He's probably the cruelest Universal monster.
I didn't even know that. I should see it again. But at one point, I set my entire room up, which was not that grandiose, but with strings attached to everything, and they would lead to the bathroom where I would close the door and invite unsuspecting friends and relatives into my room, where, as I pulled the strings, basically things would just move across the floor. In my mind, they were like the silverware was going in the air, and they would think invisible people were there, but it didn't work out too well.
Can you share, I guess, beginning with this week with the sad news of George Romero's passing, can you share what it was like to work with him on Tales from the Dark Side?
Well, I never saw him.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know if that was part of the deal or not, but he wrote the pilot for Tales from the Dark Side, which I don't know if anybody ever saw it, but it's about a miser on Halloween that gets his comeuppance. It was really nicely written. I mean, he really could write very nicely. But I think whoever bought the thing didn't want him to direct it, because the interesting thing about George, which I guess, you being here means you probably know more about him than I do, but I really liked him, talking to him and everything. He was complimentary, and, he wasn't a scary writer who, wanted to shut the production down or anything like that. But the thing about George was, he had made Night of the Living Dead, 2 years? Every weekend he went out with his friends and shot a movie, the equivalent of making a $300 million horror movie in 64?
68, yeah.
68. But he couldn't really work in the real world where you paid people and had to stop after 14 hours and have that kind. The way, I do think it's a wonderful movie, Night of the Living Dead. But I also think that it happened because it evolved with his friends in real time. I mean, so he would get to know people, and then they'd add something, and it really, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could make all movies like that? But he couldn't really fit into the real world of movie making. So I guess I was there's nothing more to say about it, I guess. But he wasn't mad that we did this.
Well, it's interesting, you directed television, which I guess conventional thought believes that you don't get to play as much as you do in Parents, and Parents is really playful with style. Did you feel sort of the world opening up and you could really do, there's like split diopter going on. There's so many wonderful transitions.
It was interesting. Vestron, which is a company that made 250 movies, I think, in a couple of years, and had one movie that made money. They made Dirty Dancing, and it was the one movie they were determined never to release. When I got this little job, the joke and the thing was, there's this horrible movie. If you get to really know them and they trust you, they'll show it to you, but they don't want anybody to know that they made this movie. And then they showed it to a couple of people and one publicist who was very smart. And they went, no, this is your hit movie. These other things you're making are, don't show them to people, but do show this one to people. What was the question?
Oh, just about you playing on Parents. I mean, how playful the style
So
of
these Vestron people did something that nobody's ever done with me on anything, not that I've done so much. They actually said to me, now, about 6 weeks before we start shooting, will you show us a book? Tell us what the shots are and how you see these things, and just talk your way through the whole movie. I mean, it wasn't stupid. I'd never directed a movie before, and had hardly directed anything, I think. Like nothing. And it forced me to start thinking about it. And truthfully, I had always, since I read it, started thinking, how can I make this be from the boy's point of view? What can I do about this that will make it somewhat visceral? And it really made me, I would have probably written it down anyway, but it really made me focus more carefully on how I was going to do the small amount of interesting, special, or tricky things that I tried to do here. With a purpose, not just to be, unusual, but to try to present life from a small, frightened child's point of view, which was my point of view and still is much of the time.
Of course, well, even, the transitions you think about from his nightmares into the real world, they feel so seamless so that you really do start to understand that maybe these are more of an omen than illogical dreams.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't aware of that. There you go.
After this, we're showing My Boyfriend's Back.
Oh, okay.
Which, you seem to be surprised.
Is anybody staying?
Great affection for it.
Oh, okay.
Who has affection for My Boyfriend's Back?
Well, 3 people applauded it.
See, I think that's more than you thought, did.
Well, here's the thing. Some of my best friends agreed to be in the movie, so there are some very fun, I think, performances in the movie. It was one of my least favorite experiences I've ever had, but...
Why?
I can't talk about it. For the usual reasons. There were rules, and you can't move the camera, and you're not allowed to do this, and you can't shoot on contrasty days. You can only shoot on really sunny days or really dark. Things that, I don't know why anybody would say that, but it was very restrictive. But I love being with the actors, and then I try to forget about it as much as I can.
Well,
they were great.
It had a different title, as you told me earlier.
Oh yeah, I did tell you that. The original title was Johnny Zombie, and then when they made the trailer for the movie, they somehow decided to put in the music from the song My Boyfriend's Back, and then call the movie My Boyfriend's Back. But when they released the movie, they didn't really have much confidence in it, so they didn't feel it was worth spending the money for the song My Boyfriend's Back, so they just called it My Boyfriend's Back and didn't put it into the movie. Sort of a giant show of let's cut our losses quickly. But kids liked it, I guess. Absolutely. I don't know.
Have you warmed up to it all?
No.
No.
No, but I love there are many people, a couple of people that became famous who hadn't been famous before that you might see in the movie. Matthew McConaughey has one line in the movie. I don't know if the people who saw the movie went, oh my God, it's Matthew McConaughey. But it was rather dark in the movie theater. He stands up during a movie where Johnny Zombie is in the movie theater and screams, kill the zombie. That was his part. We had a real kind of scary bully character who the zombie eats in the movie at some point. And he quit or something a few days before we started. So Phil Hoffman was the emergency replacement for the mean jock. And he was wonderful, and I mean, he's lovely in the movie, but fortunately, he didn't make a career out of playing mean jocks who get eaten by zombies. But he did say to me, and I really never forgot this, and we became friends, and and we all loved Philip, whoever worked with him. But Philip came up to me when we had the read-through, and he came up and he said, Bob, I just want you to know I don't only play zombies. I can be romantic, I can be scary, I can be funny, I can basically do any. He laid out exactly what Phil was. He said, I can play anybody, I can transform myself. And it sounds egomaniacal when I say it, but it literally just sounded like this sweet, young person who really could do anything in the world and just wanted to make sure people knew it and didn't just think he was like a tough jock person. And I never forgot that. And whenever I saw him after that, when I watched him in a movie, I went, he could be Truman Capote, he could be the sweetest, nicest, horrible, romantic or not romantic people. He really could do anything. And so that's the fun of doing these odd little things. You get to find people for the first time sometimes. We found Renee Zellweger. She had never done anything before, and she didn't end up in the movie for not through her fault, but she's not in this movie. And boy, is she lucky, I think, but that's okay.
Well, she ended up in a very bad Texas Chainsaw film with Matthew McConaughey, so she didn't get off easy.
So they were almost in 2 movies together.
Do we have any questions from the audience tonight? Your question, if anyone couldn't hear, was about directing some episodes of Eerie, Indiana, which is another sort of beloved property that I think a lot of young people discovered, like My Boyfriend's Back.
I guess. And it was kind of like that. It was, it's a genre, I guess. They don't call it 1955, but it's like a cheery, Happyville kind of place with a lurking sort of surprise under it. I think I directed 4 or 5, I don't really remember. But I loved it. I had the best time. The cast was great. I thought the stories were really good, and I really had fun. I don't remember that much about it, other than it was a really, really good experience. And then they rounded them up and started putting them on Nick at Night, I think 7 or 8 years ago, I don't remember.
And I know Joe Dante was involved with Eerie, Indiana. Did you collaborate with him at all?
I saw him.
Hanging out.
I wouldn't call it a collaboration, but we did pass each other sometimes.
Questions?
Does
Yes?
anybody want to say, why did you do this?
The question was about the incredible shot in Parents, where the camera pulls back up and out of the house.
Yeah, Sandy Dennis screams and it leaves. So, I thought about that for a few days, I suppose. And my assistant was wonderful. And my assistant, Nathaniel Kahn, went on to make My Architect, the wonderful documentary about his dad, Louis Kahn. So Nathaniel had grown up being around building and practical things, and I'm not terribly practical. So I had this idea that the camera should be very close on Sandy Dennis, and it should pull back and then discover itself to be inside of the air conditioning ducts, which have a grid at the front of them. So how could we do that? We had to make the grids big enough so that you could press the lens right up to the grid and you wouldn't know that you were inside of anything. We made a little, are you asking like literally how did we do it? Oh, okay. Because this could not be the right answer, I'm not sure. So we had a section on some wheels that was almost like a dolly. And the camera was attached to the inside of it with a big long string. And then we had this long stretch of about 300 feet of house that it could go through. So we got close to Sandy Dennis with our little separate unit, which is, think of it as a camera sitting on top of a dolly that is actually a piece of grating and air conditioning duct. She screams, we start pulling back. We then have to join the unit that isn't attached to the rest of the air conditioning duct, and then that sort of crashes into it, which why it always goes like that every time. I mean, you've only seen the movie once, but I, in editing, had to see that shot like 100 times, and it always shook. We couldn't really get it not to shake, but it was okay. And then it suddenly gets inside, the unit is now joined, and then the camera's on wheels and is pulled by a rope 200 feet away by a very strong person who pulls it through, and we undercranked it so it looked like it was going faster. And then we get to the end. And then we make some stops along the way, which obviously aren't really coming up from gratings, where we go up somebody's room and then we end up out of the chimney and then see poor Sandy Dennis rushing over with little Brian Modorsky to assure him that everything's okay and your parents really aren't cannibals. So that's how we did that. And Nathaniel was really helpful, because I didn't really know how to do it. Thank you. Thank you.
So the question is, will you return to the genre? Which I think
Well,
we all
I
hope
was
you might.
my specialty is being on the periphery of things, so I probably wouldn't be in the center of it. But it was fun. I did an Amazing Stories episode where Milton Berle, 3 aliens were sent from outer space because their planet lacked humor, and they were sent to bring back humor from the United States. It was really kind of a cute idea. And so we had like 4 people. One of the 4 people had to be gotten, or we couldn't do this. So we got Milton Berle, which was really pretty exciting because, you know, chance to work with Milton Berle. And he was great, and I liked him very much. But he had 2 things he did that I thought kind of stood out. One was he would come up to me before a scene, and he would say, "Okay, Bob, now, who am I in this scene? Am I Milton or am I Uncle Milty?" And he really meant it, because like many stand-up comics, he was a really good actor, but he mostly divided into things. Am I being really serious and mean right now? Or am I being funny and the children won't be afraid of me right now? And he had to know that. The other thing is, as happens to everybody, and it is half-hour TV and you don't exactly get the script much in advance, he would say, "Now, what are the little children I'm talking to right now? Can you get a taller child over in that direction?" And then he would go over to the taller child, and he'd have all his lines he spoke in that direction, and he would glue them on a piece of paper to that boy's forehead. So he had to be tall, because like Milton was standing there, but when he went over and looked like this, then you had to get a short person to have the lines written on the short person's head.
It's incredible.
Well, that's what happens when you work with comedians. Well, yes, it's a nice question. I mean, thank you. I don't know that it really helped that much. But if you think about it, directors never get to see other people directing, which is one of the reasons, in a good way, you can be a real auteur director, because you don't know how other people are doing it. You know what their shots end up being, but you really don't know how it's done. So in a funny way, most directors sort of just act the way they think everybody does it, or they don't think about it. But when you're an actor, I've been in, 100 movies, maybe with 30 maybe distinguished directors. And you do get to see up close and in real time, you get to see how a lot of really interesting people work, and everybody is different. I worked with Sidney Lumet, I actually, and I did learn things. Mostly what I learned, if I could encapsulate it, was don't talk too much. In the beginning, when I first started doing things, I had to explain everything. I hate it when I'm acting and somebody comes in and says, "Okay, now this is a scene about this," and they come in and they do this. It's like, well, I read the script, maybe I'll have an idea of my own or something, but as soon as somebody tells you what it's about, unfortunately, it sits in your head and you kind of can't get rid of it. So one simple thing I learned is just talk when you have to talk. I had acted in a movie called Prince of the City that Sidney Lumet directed, and just had an amazing experience watching him. And then after it was over, I asked him if I could apprentice myself to him, just to study him on his next movie, which he would very generously agreed to do. And I followed him around for, about 5 months, and got to do things that you would never do just as an actor working with a great director. He would explain things to me. He took me into meetings with the prop people, with the cinematographer. How did he have a concept for the movie? And it really was very, very helpful.
What was the film that you apprenticed on?
It was with Chris Reeve, and it was Death Trap.
Oh, wow.
But a very non-Sidney Lumet movie, because if you think about Sidney, you think of police, tough people in New York, stuff. You don't think of a bunch of people in the country in a little murder
Death
situation.
Trap is so fun.
It's a fun movie, yeah. Among other things, literally, Sidney had 4 weeks of rehearsal for the movie, which it was in a room bigger than this. Every single scene was laid out on the floor, with tape to the exact dimensions, and you rehearsed on the block wherever that thing was taking place. And then you did run-throughs of the entire movie, so that, for instance, Treat Williams, even though it was shot out of sequence, had a good sense of where he was in the movie by doing that. I worked with Sidney Pollack about a month after that, or a couple of months after that, and we were doing Absence of Malice. And at one point, Sidney saw me and another actor running our lines before a scene was going on, and he said, "Don't run your lines now. Do it when we're shooting. Let's see the mistakes on film. It's much more interesting." And 2 equally wonderful directors had totally different approach to everything. And then sometimes I would notice in Sidney's preparation, it was great for the speed of the movie, but it didn't. Some people are better when they don't rehearse, and other people are better when they rehearse forever and ever. So it's kind of essentially, as Sidney said, you speak to an actor in any language that they understand. And if they understand faster, slower, louder, softer, that's how you talk. And if they come from the actor studio, you work with them in a different way. It's up to you. And that was probably the best lesson.
Our question asker mentioned Altered Stage, which I know is a film that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts. I was wondering.
I'm working with Bill Hurt right now.
Ah.
Actually, if you remember that Bill was the star of the movie, that was his first movie. And we played good friends, and we play friendly enemies in a series right now we're doing, based on 3 Days of the Condor.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
That's awesome.
Could be.
I was wondering if you could talk about Altered States a bit and your experience on the film working
I
with
guess
Ken
I can
Russell.
talk about it because Ken's dead, right?
Yeah.
I love Ken Russell. I think he's great, but he was mentally ill. And he didn't want to be controlled. And the original director was Arthur Penn for Altered States, and Bill and Blair and I had been hired. And then they fired Arthur Penn. It was a little unclear. I think Arthur really didn't like California. This was a huge special effects movie. Arthur didn't like any of that stuff. He never did that in any of his movies. And it was a big rift because he was friends with the producer and Patty Chayefsky, and they were all good friends, and now they're not friends anymore. But they had spent several $1 million preparing for the movie, and it was in everybody's interest to make the movie. Nobody wants to take over a movie from Arthur Penn. It's not whatever. And Ken Russell said yes, because Ken, didn't really get too many jobs. He was known to be incredibly difficult and strange. And he was really inspired and had great things about him, but he did not fit into boxes particularly well. So we come to have our 4 weeks of rehearsal because Bill Hurt, wisely coming from the theater, I think he had a strong enough position there to say, I want rehearsal. And it was like normal rehearsal. We were in a room and the four of us rehearsed and stuff. And as the weeks went on, Ken's lunch hour turned from 1 hour to 2 to 3 to 4 hours because it takes a long time to drink that much. And Patty would come up to me and say, Bob, he seems so normal. I mean, I was so worried about him directing this movie. And we obviously, I wasn't going to rat out Ken Russell, and I didn't, who knew? We kind of didn't know what to say. But it was fine. Then we go to the first day, and it's a very innocuous scene in which the four of us, two couples, are getting back together again, having been apart for 8 months on a sabbatical. We're college professors. It's all very, intelligent. And we have a little scene at a restaurant of like, welcome back, and then the adventure sort of begins after that. But Ken Russell had an interesting quality, which is every day on the movie had to have an orgasm. I mean, something major had to happen. It had to be explosive. It had to be exciting. Even it was a simple scene where four professors get together. So the day starts normally. It's day one of shooting. And after a couple of shots, Ken advises everybody, or the four of us, to start getting drunker and drunker until people are throwing up on the table. And Patty Chayefsky's like going, Ken, are you sure? This is really a good thing. And then they go off and have lunch. We hear a lot of screaming from the trailer. We come back. Patty left for New York, never came back. 7 executives in limousines come. Ken Russell is on a crane with a cowboy hat on, directing a shot, going, woohoo, woohoo. And my God, people were just watching their, $35 million go down the drain. And from then on, it was a very interesting experience because Ken was not allowed to change the dialogue because Arthur Penn had a dramatist guild type contract, which nobody gets in movies. As you probably know in movies, if you don't feel like saying somebody's words, don't say them, make up, read from a book, do whatever you want. And Patty, you had to say the words. But he didn't put in his contract that you had to have the visuals that he had suggested. So the minute that Patty left, but he still had control, Ken did 3 things. Maybe 2 things. He instructed everybody to talk 3 times faster than normal, because that was one way he only wanted to get back at Patty, like to destroy him as much as possible. So everybody had to, and Bill can really talk fast. It's like amazing how he can talk so fast. So Bill talked fast, then all the visuals became everything Ken didn't want. So for example, there would be a scene in the movie where it says, the hairy monster, you see a little reflection of a foot, you see kind of a glint of a monster's eye in the window. There's the poor Michel Gaudreau, or whatever his name, who's a ballet dancer dressed. He was wearing nothing but a lot of hair on his body because he was like a primordial creature. Full frontal nudity, staring at the camera, head to toe. This was like the scary little shadow of the monster's foot or something became that. And then when dailies were being sent, I've never told this story out loud in particular. So nobody, it's not, I don't know, does it matter?
No.
Okay.
Well, it matters to us because it's delightful.
So no, it wasn't really delightful, but it was okay. And then Ken would get Las Figuras de los Muertos during the dailies, and they would dance around in between shots, like saying, kill Patty Chayefsky and stuff like that. And it was a really strange situation. And it went on for about 9 months.
Wow. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Well, I didn't plan on that. It was a little extra in the DVD bonuses section. But I really did like him. And he wrote a great review for parents. He rated it. I mean, they asked like 10 weird directors in England, what are your favorite American movies? And Parents was like his favorite movie, which shows you something about the movie and him and me.
Maybe you took quite a lot from him.
Maybe.
Oh, what was the distribution of Parents?
I think it did kind of what the rest of their movies did. It would open in 3 cities and close, I think. But it did really well in Canada. I don't know. Maybe it's because Brian Brodeur has a lot of friends. I was not sure. I don't know.
How was it received critically?
It got 3. Pauline Kael said great things about it, actually, which was, I have 100 copies of that book at home. And a lot of people despised it and thought it was hideous and annoying, and I can, usually as an actor, you only remember like really bad reviews. Good reviews, just very easy to forget. I think a lot of people thought it was derivative, which it probably was, but I did my best. It wasn't. It was kind of a non-event. The most exciting part of it was Vestron did throw a fantastic opening night thing, where they served a lot of rare meat. I mean, it was cute. I don't eat meat. I haven't eaten meat since my mother tried to force me to eat a steak when I was little. But I don't eat meat, but I can cook it very well.
How have you watched the reception of Parents change over the years? I mean, it clearly didn't do much then, but here we are now, and
well,
I assume you've heard a lot of nice
81
things.
people seem to like it, but I'm not aware of it, frankly, having a reception of any kind. But I guess it's kind of a cult weird thing now, which is okay.
It's nice. Well, it's interesting. A lot of people.
It hasn't changed my life too much.
I think a lot of people wouldn't, think of you as working within this genre. They know you from so many other things.
I seem so unthreatening, I guess.
Well, yeah. I don't know. Up here, you're staring at me. It's right. But you have made an impact with this film. It's funny to call it derivative because I do think now it stands out quite a lot.
Okay. I accept. Well, the truth is, whatever it is, it did come from something that I was sort of compelled to do, which I think, good or bad or however you do it, is kind of a good way to begin anything that one does in one's life. So it did come from something that I highly identified with, although I didn't realize it at the time. I can't remember, but this famous book that I don't remember what it was, is very clear about the fact that children often mistake sexual, and in fact that's what Sandy Dennis, I think, even says to him in the movie at some point. She doesn't come out and say it, but adolescence is a very scary time when you start realizing that your parents are doing things that are unimaginable. So how big a leap is it to have them, eating corpses? So I guess, I don't know if that answers it. Well, that's scary when children feel their parents' sexual attraction for themselves and don't even know what sexual attraction is, right? I think it is scary, and I think it's very threatening, frankly. I think my parents liked each other enough, but I didn't see a lot of direct affection between them, although they lasted a long time together and seemed to be very happy. But they weren't like Randy and Sandy. I mean, Randy and Mary, Beth.
I hope everyone is staying for my boyfriend's back. Thank you, Mr. Bob Balaban, for your time.
Thank you.
Parents is a wonderful film. It's out on Blu-ray now from Vestron and Lionsgate, I believe.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's on Blu-ray. I had to watch the movie last year and talk all during it, which is kind of like what I did now.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you know people who haven't seen Parents, tell them it's available on a beautiful Blu-ray and it's terrific.
Yes, it is. Thank you.